Welcome back to Flindog Woodwork. So there's a lot of myths and legends out there. Whether it's Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, there's a lot of people that believe in things that may or may not be true. Well, that also goes for woodworking. Today we're going to take a look at 20 things that I was told as an early beginning woodworker that may or may not be true. So let's take a look at this first myth. So in today's video, we're going to be talking a lot about things that I learned early in woodworking from YouTube. Now, a lot of these things were absolute myths, but some of these things were things that I just didn't know about that I think are valuable to any woodworker. So let's take a look at our first item. So when you first start woodworking and you go to YouTube, you're going to find out that pocket holes get a really bad rap. However, when you first start out, you don't know any joinery techniques. You don't know how to do mortise and tenons. You don't know how to do dovetails. And that's why I think that the actual pocket hole is an excellent technique for the beginning woodworker. In fact, you'll find that a lot of professionals, especially people that install things like cabinets, use pocket holes on a regular basis. So if you're a beginning woodworker, don't let the expert on YouTube discourage you from this excellent joinery technique. Now let's move on to our second item. So I have hairy armpits and I never shave my legs. I do like to meditate, however. Let me show you where I meditate in my shop. So every single project build that I see on YouTube almost always ends with the YouTuber saying, I'm going to finish this project with everybody's least favorite thing, and that's sanding. But that's just not the case for me. I truly find sanding as a way to meditate in my shop. I put on some headphones, I listen to a podcast, I strike my line on my workpiece, I get my sander out, and I just think for a bit. So you don't have to hate sanding. For me, I really do truly use it as a form of meditation. I also really enjoy seeing that wood grain come out after I'm done sanding. Plus, you can't beat the feel of a freshly sanded piece of wood. My third item that I want to talk about today has everything to do with saving you a few bucks and not going out and buying the most expensive tool. So I know you've seen it and a lot of people get jealous of it, but every single woodworker on YouTube has got a woodpecker's wall, and that is a mistake in my opinion. Now don't get me wrong, I love my woodpecker's tools. However, for the price of some of these measuring devices, you can buy a power tool. And really, is one decent square better than another? Well, let's check. So here are two squares. This is a Swanson square that's just under $10, and this is a woodpecker square that's just under $200, believe it or not. Let's see if the Swanson square is actually square. And I see no variation in that line. So if you're just starting out, don't be jealous of those woodpecker's walls. Save your money, buy some power tools, and you can save up for those woodpeckers down the road. If you even want woodpecker squares down the road. Honestly, square, square. Now the next two things in my list of items that I didn't know in early woodworking relate to project mistakes and errors. Let's talk about it. So we are not machines. Now I've been called a tool a lot, however I'm not a machine. Now machines almost always make things perfect. As a woodworker, however, we never make anything perfect. So if I were to look at some of the best projects that I think I've ever created in my woodworking career, I've made some errors in them. Check out this dresser that I made for one of my sons. Now I did have to make 3 of these, but as you can see, I overcut this domino right here. So just go into this woodworking journey knowing that you're never going to create something that's absolutely perfect and flawless. In fact, it's these errors and mistakes that allow us to grow in our craft. By figuring out how to fix these small errors, your skill set grows with each error you make. So the next thing that I want to talk about is something that I just broke my own rule on, and that's pointing out your mistakes. Now I just showed you that overshoot that I did with a domino on my child's dresser. So I've never pointed out that domino error to anyone, and I'm sure no one has ever noticed it. Now when I first started woodworking, I'd finish up a project, I'd take it upstairs, and I'd show my wife. I'd tell her, I love the way this looks, however you can see I made this little error on this corner. And that was an absolutely idiotic thing to do. I'm here to tell you, when you present a project to someone or tell somebody that you made this item, they're not going to be taking a magnifying glass and looking for the errors in your projects. They're simply going to appreciate that you took the time and effort to use your craft to build something. And that's really all that matters. So don't point out your mistakes to others. So that's our first 5 things that I didn't know about in early woodworking or myths that I believed in. Now before we move on to our 6th item, I ask you to do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and leave a like, as it really does help out this small growing channel. So the next thing that I want to talk about is something that I had no idea about when I first started woodworking, and that's that pine does not stain very well on its own. So I know for me, when I first started out, I would go to Home Depot or Lowe's and get some stain. I'd build a project out of construction lumber, and then I'd apply the stain to the pine. Now, one thing that I learned after a couple of projects is that pine doesn't stain very well, and that you have to apply something like this preconditioner to the pine for the actual stain to adhere to the pine in a very even fashion. If you don't apply something like a preconditioner to your pine before you stain it, your pine can appear very blotchy, and that's the last thing you want after spending all that time on that beautiful project. So save yourself the headache and get yourself some pre-stain conditioner if you're going to be staining your projects. Now let's talk about sanding. So when I first started woodworking, I would start with a really rough grit, something like an 80 grit. Then I would move all the way up to a 220 to get that finished smooth sanding look that I was going for. What I didn't know is there's actually a method to sanding. If you want to avoid things like pigtails on your workpieces, you have to go through a certain process. So let's take a closer look at this process. So here's the deal. You never want to go up a sandpaper grit higher than 50% of your previous grit. So if we want to go from 80 to 220, let's take a look at how we need to get there. So believe it or not, if we want to go from 80 grit all the way to 220, we have to go through 4 grits of sandpaper. If we start with 80, we go up 50%, which gets us to 120. Then from 120, we go up another 50% to get us to 180. After that, we can then go to the 220. So obviously this is a little bit more time consuming, but if you want to avoid those pigtails and have that perfect finish in the end, you need to go through this process. Now let's move on to our next item. Now when I first started woodworking, I thought I knew everything about the tape measure. However, there's a little feature on the end of this tape measure that's something that I think most beginning woodworkers have no idea about. Let's take a closer look. So you've all seen the end of a tape measure. It's kind of wiggly and it's not really on there very secure. I always thought that's just the way these tape measures were made, but there's actually a purpose for it. Let's take a closer look. So believe it or not, the little wiggle in the end of a tape measure is to account for the thickness of the actual tab. If you're doing an interior measurement, it will actually push up against there so that you can create the perfect measurement. If you're doing an exterior measurement, it will pull out and you can have a perfect measurement as well. So for me, it was really hard to believe that they actually accounted for the thickness of this little tab when making these tape measures. That means that your measurements will be just that more accurate. So now let's talk about early furniture building in your woodworking career. Now when we first start out, most of the wood that's available is construction lumber that's available to us at our big box stores. Now if you go to YouTube, you're not going to find a ton of people making furniture out of construction lumber, other than maybe Steve Ramsey from Woodworking for Mere Mortals. Everybody will be using walnut, maple, mahogany, and other really nice hardwoods. However, hardwoods are quite expensive. But I'm here to tell you I made some of my best furniture in my early woodworking career from construction lumber. So don't feel like you have to start off with hardwood. Use some 2x4s, use some plywood, go to Home Depot, buy a bunch of wood and start making something. Once you get your skill set up, you can then move on to hardwood. So the next thing I want to talk about is related to using that construction lumber. One of the best things that I did when I first started woodworking was starting to create some shop furniture out of construction lumber before I moved on to making things for my home. Let's take a look at some of the things I created in my early woodworking career. So let's take a look at this workbench. This workbench is made entirely from construction lumber. It's made of 1x4s, 2x4s, OSB, and even some pegboard. This sanding station was one of my first projects that I ever made that allowed me to practice some of my joinery. This miter station was also one of my first projects. It was some of the first miter joints that I ever created on any sort of workpiece. So get out there and start building some shop furniture, and it will give you the confidence you need to start building furniture for your home. All right, well that's 10 items down and only 10 more to go. Before we move on to our 11th item, make sure you do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, as it really does help out this small growing channel. All right, now let's talk about accuracy for a bit. Now when you first start woodworking, you may assume that the scales on your power tools are completely accurate, but that's just not true. So let's take a look at this table saw, for example. Now this has a scale going from 0 to 45 degrees for the angle of the saw blade. Now I'm here to tell you I would never trust this scale. There's something that you need to make sure that actually all these measurements are completely accurate. So one of the best pieces of advice I could give an early woodworker is to get some measuring devices, like this angle finder for the table saw. Let's take a closer look at some other measuring devices. So these are the main measuring devices that I use on a regular basis. You can see that there's a router gauge for your router, there's an angle finder for your table saw, there's actually a digital protractor, as well as a digital caliper. And these are all things that are valuable tools for your shop. Now I'm a big proponent for getting digital measuring devices for your workshop. This allows you to easily see what your measurements are at and be able to creep up on those exact measurements. I'll leave some links in the description below for some digital measuring devices. Since we're talking about measurements, let's move on to our next item, which is talking about the measurements of materials we buy at the big box stores. So here are just two items that you can buy at a big box store that you can't rely upon the measurements. This is a 2x4 and this is some 1/2-inch plywood. Let's do some measurements and see if these add up. So the old trusty 2x4, you can always count on these things being 2 inches by 4 inches, right? Well, not quite. These are always 1.5 inches approximately by 3.5 inches wide. Well, surely we can count on this 1/2-inch plywood being 1/2 inch thick. So these are things I had no idea about in early woodworking. 2x4s were not 2 inches by 4 inches. 1/2-inch plywood or 3/4 inch plywood was not 1/2 inch or 3/4 inches thick. Therefore, when you're first starting out, take some extra consideration when measuring your materials. This becomes extremely important if you're doing things like dados in your stock. In fact, they even make things like plywood dado bits that account for this variation in the thickness of your material. Alright, so that's enough about measurement for a bit. Now let's talk about the price of woodworking. So the nice thing about woodworking is that you're going to be saving a ton of money by building those special projects out of your hardwoods and other materials. Nope, not true. Woodworking is a passion project. It's something you get into because you really enjoy the process of converting raw material into a final project. If you're looking to save money by woodworking, then you probably need to reevaluate your motives. Woodworking can be very expensive. You have to buy a lot of power tools. You have to buy the materials such as hardwoods, which are very expensive. You also have to buy consumables like sandpaper and glue. So if you're looking to save some money, I suggest you head over to IKEA. However, if you're looking for a new hobby where you'll create endless satisfaction on creating your own projects, then I suggest you get into woodworking. So since we're talking about money, let's move on to our next item, which is where you should buy your hardwoods. So when I first started woodworking, I would go into stores like Rockler and Woodcraft, and I would see all the hardwoods on the wall. I assume this is where most woodworkers purchase their hardwoods. But I'm here to tell you that the hardwoods in these stores is extremely expensive. This piece right here, I've had in my shop for a little over a year. And this cost $27.99, and that's before the price of lumber has gone up. Now, if I were to purchase this piece of wood today, I would suspect that this piece of wood would be well over $40. Now, if we look in the back here, you can see all of my hardwoods. Now, most of this hardwood is rough cut. That means that it needs to be put through the planer and jointer before it's in a workable shape. So I'm not suggesting that you get a planer and jointer right off the bat. I am, however, suggesting that you find out where your local sawmill is. So it's these local sawmills that have a variety of more local hardwoods as well as exotics. Not only do they have more variety and inventory, but the prices are substantially cheaper. So my local sawmill is a place called Frank Miller Lumber, and I like to visit there about once or twice a month. When I was talking to some of the employees at this sawmill, they told me that they actually sell their lumber to Woodcraft and Rockler. So cut out the middleman and go to your local sawmill and support a local business. So since we're talking about wood, let's move on to our next topic, and that's wood movement. Now, when I first started woodworking, I gave no consideration to wood movement. And since I thought wood movement was something that only professional woodworkers needed to worry about, I actually messed up a lot of my early woodworking projects. So if we take a look at this table right here, this is one of the first projects that I ever built, and I was super proud of it. However, I gave no consideration to wood movement. Once I created the table, I actually sealed the top with epoxy. However, I didn't seal the bottom. Therefore, the epoxy separated from the tabletop. It's because of this wood movement and the separation of the epoxy from the wood that I now have to create a new tabletop, which is something that I'm doing right now. So if you're just getting into woodworking, just know that wood movement is a real thing and it can affect your projects. Since the humidity in the air changes with the seasons, you need to make sure that you're considering wood movement. All right, well, I know we're going a little bit fast today, so try to keep up. That's 15 items down so far. Before we move on to our 16th item, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Now for our 16th item, we're going to be talking about routing. Now routing is something that completely alienated me when I first got into woodworking, but there's one step that I didn't know about. Let's talk about it. So when you're routing, you need to think about grain direction. Now when I first started routing, I would get tear out constantly, and that's because I wouldn't think about the grain direction. So on the end of a board is the end grain, and this is the type of wood that's most susceptible to tear out. If we look at this piece of wood right here, you can see that I've chamfered the entire edge of this end grain, and you can see I have some tear out at the very end. And this is the rule that I didn't know about. You always want to route the end grain before you do the long grain. And this is because once you route the end grain, you can always clean up the long grain by doing that side last, since the long grain is less susceptible to tear out. So I'll take this piece of wood with a little bit of tear out and take it to the router table and clean up that tear out. And you can see from this, that's a perfect chamfered edge. So this is a rule that I follow with every project. I always route out the end grain and then do the long grain second. This prevents any sort of tear out and makes my project look perfect. Now that we've covered router tear out, let's talk about our next item, which is dust collection. When I first started woodworking, I didn't think dust collection was an important thing. I would see all the warnings on my tools and see all the California laws that have been passed that say that dust inhalation can cause things like cancer, and this is something that I just didn't think was important to me. I simply thought that dust collection was just something you did just to make sure that your cleanup was just a little bit more bearable. If you attached a dust collector to a table saw or a router, you wouldn't have to use your broom as much. But since then, I found that it's just the tiniest little pieces of wood debris that cause the damage to your lungs. Now, when I've spent an entire day in the workshop, a lot of times I'll go up to the house and realize that I'm wheezing, and that's just not normal. It's because of this wheezing that I've made it a real priority to try to collect as much dust as possible. It's this guy right here that I recently added to my shop that really does a great job of getting out those really small pieces of dust that are only a micron or two thick. If we look at my main dust collector in my shop, I used to think it was the debris that's caught in this plastic bag that was the stuff I should be worried about. But in fact, it's the stuff that's caught by this filter on top that's the real benefit of having a dust collector like this one. When you first start woodworking, you probably don't have the air filtration systems like I just showed you. However, you can prevent all this dust inhalation with an N95 mask. So whether you're using a disposable version or a reusable version, just make sure you put that mask on, as it really does help. Well, that's enough about lung protection. Now let's move on to our next two items, which have everything to do with finishing up a project. So first up, let's talk about wood glue. Now, wood glue was my biggest enemy when I first started woodworking. I would glue up a project and wipe off that wood glue, and then I'd go to stain it. After that glue would dry, I'd go to get a stain, and I'd apply the stain, and I'd realize that the colors just wouldn't match up where I applied that glue. Now, this is a very common mistake in early woodworking. Wood glue clogs all the pores in that wood and doesn't allow the stain to penetrate inside the wood. Therefore, there's a color variation in the areas where you wiped off that glue and the areas that had no glue on it. Therefore, it's extremely important to make sure you get rid of all that glue. A lot of times, I'll take a damp rag and wipe it down just to make sure that all that glue is completely eliminated. Using a damp cloth along with some extra sanding will make sure that your workpiece has a nice even color throughout the entire project. So now that we've talked about the effects of wood glue on wood finishes, now let's talk about some clear coat finishes that you apply to things like hardwoods. So there are a variety of clear coat finishes that you can apply to your hardwoods once your projects are complete. However, I think there's one clear coat finish that's the best finish to use if you're a beginning woodworker, and that's lacquer. Let's talk about lacquer for a bit. So there are a variety of ways to apply lacquer. You can either spray it on or you can brush it on. So lacquer is a very easy finish to apply. It's much easier than polyurethane in my opinion, and that's simply because you don't have to sand in between each coat. So the nice thing about lacquer is that it creates a chemical bond between each coat that you apply. The difference between this and polyurethane is that you need to sand between each coat of polyurethane so that you can scuff up that surface so the polyurethane will adhere to the previous coat. It's because of this ease of application that I think it's a great idea for beginning woodworkers to start off with using lacquer when they're finishing their projects. Now, sanding isn't completely eliminated with lacquer, as I do like to sand the second to last coat so that I have a nice smooth surface to apply that last coat. So that's enough about finishing. Let's move on to our next item, which is something that has a dual purpose that I use on a regular basis in my shop. Let's go take a look at it. So this stuff comes in a can, and it is mineral spirits. This thing has two uses in my shop that I use it for all the time. When I first started woodworking, I didn't know how powerful this chemical was. Let's take a look at the first thing I use it for. So mineral spirits are a great cleaning solution. I use it all the time after doing some finish sanding right before I apply my finish. I can get rid of all that sawdust from the sandpaper and make sure my surface is completely clean prior to putting on that finish. Now, for example, I'm going to take this assembly table here, and this has got all sorts of dust and debris on it. By simply applying a little bit of mineral spirits to a rag, I can get rid of all that debris. After those mineral spirits are applied, that surface looks brand new. The second thing that I use mineral spirits for is almost like magic the first time you use it. Now, a lot of times after painting or staining a project, I'll take a can of mineral spirits and apply a little bit of mineral spirits to a rag. If you wipe it on your hands, it gets rid of all that stain and all that paint almost immediately. This truly is amazing the first time you try it. With just a little bit of mineral spirits on a rag, you can get rid of paint that would stay on your skin after multiple showers. These are just two of the amazing things I use mineral spirits for in my workshop that I had no idea about when I first started woodworking. So pick up a can at Home Depot or Lowe's and you won't be disappointed. Well, believe it or not, that makes 20 myths or things I didn't know about my early woodworking career. Now, you may have known about a lot of these things. However, I do think it's important to share these with people that are just getting into woodworking. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like, as it really does help out this small woodworking channel. Until next time, take care as always.